Sechas Nazir Daf Men Vav begins immediately following a Mishnah and introduces a brisa that has the same discussion as our Mishnah as to when the restrictions of Naziris end. The Gemara will analyze the source of that machlokes as well as bring a maimer of Rav and discuss how that fits into this brisa. The Gemara will have two versions of the entire discussion, which end in opposing manner. And then towards the end of the daf, we'll get to our last Mishnah, which discusses what happens if one of the Kabbanis is puzzle, how does that affect the haircut, and what's the procedure going forward, and the Gemara will again explain it. So we've seen in our last Mishnah a machlokas between the Tanakama and Rabbi Shimon. The Gemara now introduces a brisa that is the same machlokas, except instead of Tanakama and Rabbi Shimon, it's the Chachamim and the Rabbanon. The two opinions are discussing when is the Nazir allowed to drink wine, become tameh, and continue doing future haircuts. What point of the procedure? We know the procedure includes that he brings karbanos, he waves the zero b'sheila, and he takes a haircut and puts the hair in the fire. At which point is he allowed to ease his restrictions? So according to Rabbi Eliezer, it's after he does all of them in this brisa, only after he completes the entire procedure. According to Chachamim, it's after he brings one carbon, after its blood is sprinkled on the mizbech, and the carbon is completed, the restrictions are already off. So Gemara says, I understand Rabbi Eliezer's source. The pasuk seems to say clearly like him. It describes the entire procedure, and then it says va'achar yishta nazir yain, clearly implying that after the entire procedure is completed, the restrictions are off. But where did the Rabbanan get the halacha that it's after only one carbon? So the Gemara says it's because there's exer shava based on the wording. The pasuk describing says va'achar yishta nazir yain. Use the word va'achar, that it's after, that is when he can drink wine. In the previous pasuk, it talks about when he can do the haircut. It says, achar es galcha es nizroi, after one carbon, he can take the haircut. Just like there, it's talking about after one carbon, and discussing when he can drink wine, it's also talking about after one carbon. So Gemara says, that's a nice source, but maybe it's referring to the two achars together. Maybe it's saying just like the previous achar was after one carbon, now we're adding another thing that has to be achar in order to drink the wine after everything which is in this pasuk. How do you know that it's meant to say after one thing like in the previous pasuk? Maybe it's meant to pile up the achars. So Gemara answers that can't be, because that I would have said on my own. Without any Gzeir Shava, I would have said the simple reading of the pasuk after the entire procedure is completed. That is when the Nazir ends. And therefore it has to be teaching me something. It has to therefore be referring to that it's only after one carbon, just like the haircut is also only after one carbon. Okay, now the Gemara brings the statement of Rav. We're going to have two versions of the coming Gemara. It starts off the same, but then it takes a different turn. So Rav's statement is to say that the waving of the parts, the waving of the Zor B'Sheila of the carbon is not ma'akev. It does not have to be done in order for the restrictions to be taken off, in order for the Naziris to end. So the Gemara asks, according to both versions, who are you referring to? Which opinion? If you're in the Rabbanan say you don't have to do any of the procedure. All you have to do is bring one carbon. So obviously, you don't have to do the waving in order for the Naziris to end. And if you're in Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer says all the steps have to be done. So how could you tell me that the step of waving is not ma'akev? So the Gemara says, no, there is a chiddush. The chiddush is that in most karbanos that have waving, it's not considered to be part of the main part of the mitzvah. It's considered to be shiarei mitzvah, like the remnants of the mitzvah. So therefore you might think here, just like there it's not the main part of the mitzvah, here it's also not the main part of the mitzvah. So therefore we're really in Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, where you need to be after the entire procedure. But I may think this one, if you didn't do it, that's okay. It's not such a big deal, because it's not an essential part of the procedure. Therefore Rabbi Eliezer teaches that it is an essential part. Rav teaches it is an essential part of the procedure. You cannot continue, you cannot take the restrictions off you if you do not drink wine. Now the two versions take opposite approaches. According to the first version, the Gemara asks, is it true that it is ma'akev by Naziros? Rav had said that it's ma'akev, meaning Rav had said that you cannot continue, you cannot take the restrictions off unless you wave. We said that's in Rabbi Eliezer, and the chiddush is you may have thought that that's just an extra part. Is it true that you cannot take the Nazir restrictions off if you don't do the waving? So the Gemara says there's a brisa that says the phrase in the pasuk Zos Torah and Nazir says that all Nazirim have the same halacha, and that would seem to indicate whether he has hands or he doesn't have hands, the same halacha should apply to him. If that's true, someone who doesn't have hands obviously can't do the waving, and obviously then he can end his Nazirus restrictions just like somebody who has hands. And therefore it would seem to imply that having the waving be done is not ma'akev, because you see that it's not ma'akev one who doesn't have hands, and it's also not ma'akev one who has hands, because the halachas have to be the same. So the fact that having that one who can wave and one who can't wave are given the same halacha clearly shows that it's not ma'akev. So the Gemara says that's not a correct conclusion. The correct conclusion is that they both have to do a waving, and the one without hands will have to do it with the stumps of his arms. That's the right way to learn it. You're right, they both have the same halacha. They both have the same halacha that it is ma'akev, not they both have the same halacha that it's not ma'akev. And the Gemara says, I'll prove to you that that's the correct understanding of the brisa, because there's another brisa that talks about somebody who doesn't have hair. Somebody who all his hair fell out. So does he have to do a haircut? Well, he doesn't have hair to cut. So you have a brisa that says it's a machlokas beis Shammai and beis Hillel, and we have an Amora explaining how this machlokas works, and as we'll see, the two different versions of the Gemara have conflicting understandings of this machlokas beis Shammai beis Hillel. The brisa says beis Shammai says he does not have to do anything, he does not have to pass a razor over his bald head. Beis Hillel says he does have to pass a razor over his bald head. Now, what does this mean? So Ravine explains it as follows. Beis Shammai says passing a razor over his bald head won't help. It's ma'akev, and he can't do a haircut. He needs to do a haircut. He can't do a haircut, so there's no way for his Nazirus to end. Beis Hillel says, no, there is a way for his Nazirus to end. If he passes a razor over his bald head, that will make the Nazirus end. But neither of these opinions say that because he doesn't have hair, he doesn't have to pass the razor over his head. That's not the conclusion. So for the one who doesn't have arms, it's also not saying he doesn't have to wave. Of course he does have to wave, just like Beis Hillel says here he has to pass a razor over his head, even though there's no hair. In the case of the guy who doesn't have arms, he'll have to pass the razor over, he'll have to do a waving even without having hands. Now, this understanding therefore brings us to the conclusion that it is ma'akev. The waving is ma'akev, just like Rav said. So now the Gemara says this understanding of Beis Shammai, this understanding of this whole discussion, is just like Rav Pedas understood Beis Shammai. Rav Pedas also understood Beis Shammai as saying you can't do it, so it's ma'akev. Where do you see that? So Rav Pedas said Beis Shammai and Rabbi Eliezer in a different sugya hold the same thing. They both hold that if you can't do it, there's no way out. What's that sugya? Rabbi Eliezer was talking about the Taharas Mitzorah, as when a Mitzorah purifies himself, part of the procedure is that the Kohen has to put blood on his big toe and on his thumb, on his right foot. So the Brisa says, what happens if he doesn't have a big toe on his right foot? So Rabbi Eliezer says, he's stuck. It's ma'akev, and he cannot do it. Before we get to the rest of the Brisa, that's our focus point here. That's what Rav Pedas was referring to, and he's saying Beis Shammai is saying the same thing. He needs to cut off his hair, and he doesn't have any, so he can't, so he's stuck. So therefore, according to this, Ravina's understanding of what Beis Shammai held is the same as Rav Pedas's understanding of what Beis Shammai held. Now the rest of the Brisa has a couple of opinions that there is a way out for him. So Rabbi Eliezer, we already learned, Rabbi Shimon says he could put it on the stump wherever the toe is missing from, and the Chacham say he could put it on his left toe. And therefore they are saying that there is a conclusion. Okay, now we get to the second version of this discussion. According to this, when the Gemara asked the Kasha, the Gemara wasn't asking, is it not ma'akev? Is it true that it's ma'akev? The Gemara wasn't trying to bring a proof that waving the karbanos by a Nazir is not ma'akev. The Gemara was trying to bring a proof that it is ma'akev. And that it's not correct to say that it's not ma'akev. So, what's our proof that it is ma'akev? So the Gemara quotes the same brisa, where it says that someone who doesn't have hands is the same halacha as someone who has hands, and that seems to be a proof that just like someone who has hands, it's ma'akev to wave. Somebody who doesn't have hands is also going to have to figure out how to wave, and it's ma'akev for him as well. So the Gemara says, how does that fit with the discussion about having hair? There, like we saw, it's machlokas beis Shammai whether he has to pass the razor. Beis Shammai says he doesn't have to pass the razor, and Beis Hillel says he does not have to pass the razor. So the Gemara quotes that there's a different understanding there of what that machlokas is. Rabbi Avina says, when Beis Hillel says he has to pass the razor, Beis Hillel is saying he can't, and there's no way out. and therefore it's Beis Hillel's opinion that fits with what we're saying here, that it's ma'akev and there's no way out. What were Beis Shammai saying? Beis Shammai were saying he doesn't have to pass the razor because it's not ma'akev. And that would not be fitting with what we're saying here about the waiving of the karbanos. We are saying that it is ma'akev according to this version. Now the Gemara points out this understanding of Beis Shammai that is not like Rav Pidas' understanding. Rav Pidas said Beis Shammai is the same as Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says if you can't do it, it's ma'akev v'zein takana. There's no way out. But according to this version, Beis Shammai is saying there is a way out, and Beis Hillel is the one who's saying that there's no way out. Okay, that concludes that discussion. We got to our next Mishnah. It discusses what happens if the carbon became puzzle. So the Mishnah says if somebody brought a carbon and then he took his haircut based on that carbon, like we said, the haircut can be taken after the karbanos, should be after the shlamim or after the chatos, it's a machogas, but b'diavad it could be any of them. And then it turns out that that carbon was puzzle, something happened to puzzle it. So now the haircut's puzzle, because the haircut has to be done after a carbon, and the carbon is no longer there. Since the haircut's puzzle, if he goes ahead and he does the rest of the procedure, he did it without having a kosher haircut, it's also puzzle. So he loses those animals, and he has to grow his hair again and do the entire procedure over again. Now the Gemara talks about what happens if the psul was that it was shalol lishma. It was not brought as a carbon for a nazir. And the Gemara chooses the Mishnah that is, we'll discuss separately if it was a chatas or if it was a olah or shlamim. So if it was a chatas has to be done lishma, has to be with the right reason. If it's done without the right reasons, it's puzzle, and it'll be just like the halachas we said before. The haircut is puzzle, and anything that he did afterwards is puzzle as well. Now, what's if it's an olah or shlamim? So here you have a machokes. According to the Tanna Kama, it makes no difference. It's also puzzle. It's shalol lishma. The halacha is an olah or a shlamim that's brought shalol lishma is a kosher carbon, but it does not fulfill the purpose that the owner meant for it. Since he was not brought by the kohen for that purpose, it doesn't work. Now, Rabbi Shimon though says no. Here, the other karbonos are kosher, and it works. Because Rabbi Shimon says even though it was brought for the wrong reason, let's say it was brought for an adava, was not brought for an olah or a shlamim of a nazir, it still works. The other karbonos are still good, and it's fine. Now, the Mishnah concludes with the halacha that if he brought all three karbanos and then he takes a haircut and then one of them turns out to be puzzle, that's not a problem because at least he has the other ones. And he just has to fill in the other karbanos, the ones that were puzzle he needs to do again. Now the Gemara explains Rabbi Shimon's opinion. What is the reason that it's okay if it was a olah or a shlamim that was done first and turned out to be shalol lishma? So Gemara explains very simply. Rabbi Shimon holds that you're allowed to do your haircut after a carbon nidava. It does not have to be a nazir's carbon. If the nazir brought a carbon nidava, that's also enough of a reason for him to do the haircut. So by it being shalol lishma, it turned out to be a carbon nidava, and the haircut that he did is still kosher. It's not